deconstructed these walls and I found out.
Welcome to the Deconstructionists Podcast. I'm your host, John Williamson, and we have an all-new guest this week. Before we jump into that, as a reminder, our website has encountered a slight change. It was www.thedeconstructionists.com. We just made a minor tweak. It is now www.thedeconstructionists.org. So just a slight change from .com to .org. Everything else on the site remains the same. You can still listen to our entire back catalog of episodes, read our blog, link to us on social media, or grab some swag from the web store. All right, on to our guest. This week's guest is columnist and broadcaster Carrie Sheffield. Carrie is a senior policy analyst at Independent Women's Forum and earned her master's in public policy from Harvard University, concentrating on business policy. She earned a BA with honors in communications at Brigham Young University and completed a Fulbright Fellowship in Berlin. Carrie covered Congress for the Hill newspaper and was a founding reporter at Politico. She won a Robert Novak Journalism Fellowship and contributed on political economy at Forbes, wrote editorials for the Washington Times under Tony Blankley, and advised the digital millennial women's site Bustle.com. Carrie has published in the Wall Street Journal, Time, USA Today, CNN Opinion, the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNBC, National Review, the DC Examiner, Newsweek, HuffPost, and the Daily Caller. So basically, Carrie is an absolute killer and has a much longer bio on her website that you should definitely check out at www.carriesheffield.com. And without further ado, here is part one of my interview with Carrie freaking Sheffield.
Learn to make exclusion look like love.
All right, welcome to the Deconstructionist Podcast. Carrie Sheffield, thank you so much for spending some time today with me.
Hey there, thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Absolutely. Just in the couple seconds we've been recording, I'm already realizing that my laptop was slowly dying based on the last experience I had recording. So this is exciting. You're my first one, like I said before, to record on the new computer. So before we get started, your book is, I'm always very, very impressed with folks who write from such a, personal place, because it's got to be very sort of exposing to put your life story out there, and yet you did so. So what inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, thanks for letting me share. And if folks want to see, this is the cover. It's called Motorhome Prophesies, A Journey of Healing and Forgiveness. And you're right that it is a personal book, but the more I have been out there talking about the story, and since it's come out, I really see that in a lot of ways it's a universal story. And so that helps bring me out of isolation, because that's a big thing when people are dealing with mental illness or abuse, is that the evil one wants to separate you and to draw you away and to make you feel like you're alone, and that your problems are too big for God's grace, too big for any person to help you with them. And those are lies. And so I wrote the book because I want to help people come out of isolation, whether it's people who are suffering themselves from mental illness or abuse, or people who have not had that experience but want to support them. I had a gentleman who recently read the book whose wife had grown up in a similar, very abusive, kind of fundamentalist Mormon environment as well. And he said, I know so much better now how to love her. He's like, I understand so much better. When she would try to describe things, I couldn't understand her, but now I do. So it's really been wonderful. And I had another, I've had people say when they read it, like I had a woman from a church, and she's in a wheelchair with muscular dystrophy, and she had suffered with suicidal ideation. And she told me something specific in the book that was meaningful to her. And she was so grateful because she feels trapped quite often in her body, and that the book's been helpful for her. So I just have a lot of stories like that. And so it helps me feel reaffirmed that this was God's will to help others.
That's incredible. And what cool, like, unintended, I guess, side effects, I guess, or, like, for lack of a better way to put it, of the book. Like, I'm sure you did not intend for those specific things to occur as a result of writing this book. So that's really cool.
Yeah, no, it's really been a blessing, and just having doors open and meeting new people and being able to share the story with just a whole range of people from different states and different backgrounds, and was able to speak to a church of 30,000 people. It's headquartered in Brooklyn. They've got 3 campuses, so it was streamed out on satellite. Um, but it's a predominantly Black church up in Brooklyn, and Denzel Washington goes there. And so they had me sign a book to his wife, Pauletta. So that was kind of fun to write a book to Denzel
Whoa.
Washington's wife, which was, never expecting that.
Yeah.
And then I also got to go down to Texas and film the Dr. Phil show. And they asked me to sign a book out to Dr. Phil, which was also fun. So
That's
it's been a
wild.
wild ride.
Yeah, that's very cool. Well, to kind of get started in your story, really, like, as they say, we got to start at the beginning. And so, talk about just, what was so unique about your childhood, and again, you're one of quite a large family. There were 8 kids total. You were one of those 8, and you fall somewhere in the middle there. So, talk a little bit about sort of what your childhood was like.
Yeah, so the name of the book is Motorhome Prophecies because, like you said, with the 8 children and our 2 parents, all 10 of us were living in the motorhome, which is not very sanitary or fun. Uh, it can be fun to take trips, but not to live. And so you're packing people in like sardines. And I say my childhood careened between first world and third world. So sometimes we would have houses, sometimes we would be back in the motorhome. My mom gave birth to my brother when the family was living in a tent. My When I took my ACT exam to go to college, we were living in a shed in the Ozarks with no running water, no furnace, and the winters get down in the 30s down there on average. So we had some space heaters plugged in with this electric system outside, but it wasn't enough. And so just a really dismal experience. But at the same time, we were always moving. So that was the only silver lining, is if you hated a place, you knew that we would be going somewhere soon, which if you loved a place, then the downside is you'd be leaving somewhere soon. So I ended up going to 17 public schools and homeschool. So when people say, "Where are you from?" I say, "I'm from America."
I think that's pretty accurate. So explain, like, what was it that caused you guys to move so much? Like, I know a lot of people are like, "Oh, I moved a ton," and you find out, their parents were in the military, or in my case, my dad was a pastor, so we moved a lot, but not 17 times. So what was it about, your dad's career, or what was it about the family that caused you guys to move so frequently?
Yeah, so just casually, when people ask, they would say, "Oh, are you a military brat?" And then just casually, I would say, "No, I'm a musician brat. My dad's a musician." But when you dig down into the many layers of it, I didn't tell people this because I both was ashamed, but when I was younger, I believed all of it. So he believes he's a Mormon prophet that will become president someday. So he's 86 years old and has really bad Alzheimer's now. So this is all done. He doesn't really travel, and they actually gave the motorhome to one of my brothers a couple years ago. So that part's officially over. But the childhood was basically centered around helping my dad's prophetic call. So in some ways, I was a PK pastor's kid, but it was an offshoot Mormon cult tradition. And by that, I mean, my ancestors helped to found the original church, Mormon church that we were talking about, 8 generations going back. Or even now I have cousins that are old enough to be my parents, and they have kids who are now having kids. So it's just a long, long line of LDS family. And my dad's interpretation of the theology eventually got him excommunicated. So it was not endorsed, the things he was claiming, his prophetic mantle he was claiming. And for me, that actually eventually collided because, when I say musician brat, my dad was incredibly gifted on guitar. So I talk in the book about one of his mentors who hand selected him to be one of his proteges. this mentor was named Andre Segovia. He was from Spain, and Segovia was knighted by the King of Spain for his musical genius. He has an asteroid named after him. He had 10 honorary doctorates. He had a Lifetime Grammy Achievement Award. And so he just was this incredible guitarist. And so he hand selected my dad to be both, a mentor or a mentee of him for both guitar performance and guitar musical composition. And then my dad also won a nationwide competition for the best up and coming young music writer. And he also was a professor of guitar at Brigham Young University. And he has a master's and most of a doctorate in music composition. So incredible gifting, world-class gifting. And so he took that, combining that ingredient with childhood trauma himself. So one of his first memories was being sexually molested by a Mormon babysitter from the community there in Salt Lake City. And the data shows that if you don't get that treated childhood sexual assault trauma, that your likelihood of suicide compounds with time, that it's the opposite of time heals all wounds. It gets worse. And so combine childhood trauma with exceptional musical gifting and then radicalized Mormon interpretation of theology. And then you get this homespun prophet. And so what he would do is he would take his guitar and go out on street corners and play this beautiful music and attract listeners. And then he would pass out his brochures to try to convert people to be Mormon. And eventually all 8 of us were assigned musical instruments. And with our mom, she played piano and she sang and did percussion. So all 10 of us were there on the street playing this music while attracting people and passing out brochures to try to convert them to be Mormon. And so that's why we live that way, basically like Mormon gypsies.
Or like the Mormon Partridge Family,
Yeah. Or the Mormon Osmonds or the Mormon Von Trapps. We actually knew the Osmonds a bit because at one point we had a building down in Branson. My dad had aspirations to have a musical theater down there. They call, if anyone watching or listening is not familiar with Branson, it's almost like Nashville, but more family oriented. It's like a smaller version of Nashville with music. And the Osmond brothers, the other brothers, not Donnie. So Donnie and Marie, they're in Vegas. And then the other brothers are in Branson. I should look to see if they are now. I actually haven't checked recently. I think they are still. But in any case, Jimmy Osmond, the youngest, was my Sunday school teacher for a little while.
Oh, wow.
But yeah, so we were kind of like the offshoot Mormon performing family that had a lot of mental illness. And sadly, 2 of my brothers developed schizophrenia just from all of the constant moving and then being daily indoctrinated that we were evil, that we were satanic if we ever questioned our dad, and the physical abuse. And sometimes we didn't have enough to eat. One of my first memories is child custody trying to take us away. And at one point we didn't have food and we actually ate grass from the town park. My mom boiled some grass and added it with, those little bouillon cubes in gold wrapping, which I thought were like fancy gold wrapping. She put that with boiled grass from the town square when we were living in the motorhome in a place in Missouri. And yeah, even though grass is not for human stomachs, it's for cow stomachs. We don't have 7 stomachs, but it was not pleasant. And so it was, and the thing is, I say in the book, like there's no shame in poverty, but it's about abuse combined with poverty in the name of God. And so that's why I know this podcast is about deconstruction. Well, as you might imagine, eventually I deconstructed my faith because I was looking at it through these wrong lenses, that I, for a long time, did believe my dad was a prophet. And then I would see his behavior of how he would treat us versus how he would speak publicly, and just saw this big discrepancy. Eventually, one of my schizophrenic brothers, when I was 17, tried to rape me. He groped me, and I was just traumatized. And at that point, I knew I wasn't safe, and that I needed to get some help. And so I call it my first investigative journalism project. Do I believe my dad's a prophet? And I went through on this exploration and realized I don't think that he is. And from some things that I found, including his writings. And my loyalty was colliding, like I said, between the official LDS church and my father, because in the official LDS church, which, the big church headquartered in Salt Lake City, it's like a pope. They only have one prophet at a time, and it's very orderly. And he lives in Salt Lake City, and he was not named Ralph Sheffield. So I knew he's doing this outside the authority of the official church. And so I had to make that choice. So I chose the official LDS church. And my dad spoke a prophecy over me. He raised his hand and he said, I prophesy in the name of Jesus, you'll be raped and murdered if you leave. And so I had already been attacked by my brother who had tried to rape me. And so I'm just like, gallows humor. I'm getting raped. Like, choose one path or the other, door number one, door number two, it's the same. But I'm number 5 in the birth order. Like you said, I had 4 big brothers and they were all still at home. So I blazed that trail, and I left as the first person and the first girl to leave home. And my dad said my blood changed. I was no longer his daughter. And that basically, I wasn't allowed home all through college because I was satanic, and that I would encourage my siblings to leave. So that is why eventually I left the LDS church altogether. But then I also left God, and I was agnostic. I was angry. I had seen evil things done in the name of God. And so I thought either God didn't exist, or he was a total jerk, or completely indifferent.
Yeah, I can't even imagine anyone coming out differently out of that scenario. And what's interesting is you made me think of years ago, back in 2016, on this podcast, we actually interviewed a cult expert, and some of the things, he has a fascinating book that I read, and a lot of the things you just described are exactly the things that cults use to control the people within their organization, and by virtue of the fact that he was moving you guys around constantly, he was probably inadvertently isolating you guys, because I can't imagine retaining friendships was very easy at all. So really, you only had one another to sort of lean on, I would imagine, growing up.
Exactly. Well, I don't think it was inadvertent. I think it was by design. That's the only thing I would say, because that is one of the tactics of abusive, controlling people, is to isolate. And my dad was able, sadly, to brainwash my mom against her own family also, to the point where she did not go to her own mother's funeral. She did not go to her sister's funeral. And she thinks that her family's evil, just like my dad thinks his family's evil. So pretty much they're the only 2 non-evil people in their entire extended family, which is part of why, we weren't allowed to talk to them. And also I've had long conversations with my aunts and uncles about, like, why didn't you do something? Why didn't you call child custody? It might have been one of my aunts who called it back when we were living in Boston. I don't know who it was. We still don't know who it was who called them. And it might have been a teacher. And that's the thing. There are mandatory reporters who, if you're in certain professions, you're required to report suspected child abuse. With family members, you are not required. And so that's, my aunts and uncles have said, well, we didn't know how bad it was. And it's like, well, you chose to not let yourself find out how bad it was. And they all had big families too. Like, my aunt and uncle have 10 kids, another had 11, another had 8, big families. So they're busy. I get it, but isolation is very much a key ingredient to control, for sure. And that's the same with narcissistic, just in general. If you're dating a narcissistic, abusive person, is they want to isolate you. They want to keep you away from your support.
Yeah, the tactic of you repeating this sort of mantra over and over again, that if you leave, you will die, or your life will be in shambles. You can't survive without us, is just yet again another tactic that's commonly used by cults. I mean, so I can only imagine not only like having to pull yourself away or pull yourself out of this horrific situation, but being the first person in the family to do it, and not even being the oldest, being sort of the middle child. How difficult that must have been. How old were you at the time when you started to ask these questions and start to realize that I might have to get out of here?
Yeah, well, I say in the book, getting the assault of my brother when I was 17, that was really kind of what got the wheels turning, because I knew I wasn't safe. And so I say in the book, sometimes life's most wrenching crucibles can lead us to our greatest moments of freedom. Uh, because, having your brother who's twice your size, like I'm only 5'2" and he's like 6 feet and like overweight, like, so he's like double my size, like, to grope you and try to assault you. Like, it's very jarring. And so that was, as horrible as it was actually the wake up call that I needed to start asking questions. So and then also just like a normal teenager, I was getting resentful of the fact that I had no friends, that, I would have pen pals. I would try to keep in touch with some friends, and then like they would always fall off the map, and I would just be like, why can't they just be my friend? Why do they have to stop writing me? Although it was eventually, the person who rescued me and took me out when I was 18 is when I left. She was, I'm still very close with her today, and I credit her in the book. Her name was Summer. And she came and picked me up around 3 or 4 in the morning, a couple of days after I graduated high school. And we went to her parents' house. Her parents were living in another state. It was a house they had owned, because they had left. But in any case, that's where we went. I came back after a week, though, which is common for abused women. They say on average it takes an abused woman 7 times to completely leave an abuser. But usually that's more for a romantic partner. So for a daughter, I only ended up leaving twice. And then that second time I left permanently. So, it's hard, and a lot of people say, well, why did you stay with the abuser? And it's like, you can convince yourself of a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. So you finally start to ask the questions and question whether or not your dad really was a problem. And I can only imagine too, like, he's this brilliant musician and he's this parental figure, and so why wouldn't you believe everything that comes out of his mouth? So of course you get a little older and you start to ask these questions and you finally remove yourself from the situation. So, like, talk about, because this is the most remarkable thing to me of your whole story, is the fact that not only did you bounce around like a ton, but you went to all these different schools, including a homeschool. I can't even imagine trying to patch together any kind of education when there's no continuity there at all. And yet you go off to college.
Yeah, I mean, it was that. I mean, in some ways, that's like full credit to my mom, in terms of she was the one who would get us enrolled. She was the one who had all our transcripts. She was the one who had our health records. So she was the one who would enroll and unenroll us. That was her domain. And she had an elementary education degree. So she had taught us. We all learned how to read before even going to kindergarten, and that was thanks to her. Um, but looking back now, I see, wow, she was the enabler of this, and she normalized things that should not have been normalized. And that's, to this day, I'm 41, not married, no kids. It's because I have subconsciously, and only this year has God helped me realize how much she had imprinted this behavior on me, which is, it's okay to be with an abuser. My sister ended up marrying a guy who was abusing alcohol, like was arrested for drunk driving and taken to jail. My dad had to bail him out, which is like, if Ralph Sheffield's bailing you out and my dad had been in jail in and out for street fights, you've done something wrong. And so he also physically abused my sister. And so it's like, my mom never said to her or to me, hey, you should date a drug addict, in my case. Like, hey, you should date a cheater. Because I dated 2 different men, in long-term relationships, 2 different times, who cheated on me, and were serial cheaters. They had cheated on other women too. So it wasn't just me, but I accepted their verbal abuse, their gaslighting, their narcissism, their lies. I accepted and normalized that. And that's what she did by unenrolling and enrolling us all the time, that allowed him to put us in these environments that ended up causing 3 of my siblings to attempt suicide, and myself to feel suicidal as an adult, and suffering in and out of the hospital, for me, with suicidal ideation, anxiety, depression, fibromyalgia, also known as tension myositis syndrome, like all kinds of problems that I do believe would not have manifested if this had not happened.
Yeah, absolutely. That was actually leading to my next question, which is, you mentioned that, during college, in the aftermath of removing yourself from this toxic environment, that you struggled for a long time. And I mean, I can only imagine, like, there's nobody that could have come out of that environment without some scars, like, just impossible. And so, talk a little bit about, like, how did you, like, what were some of the impacts of that situation, first of all, but how did you slowly start to kind of take control of your life, for the first time?
Yeah, well, what was interesting is that so part of what I like to call the book, like, I'm like, this book is like my anti-resume. So because I had nobody as a safety net really who would have, I mean, I did have some aunts and uncles who were very supportive of me once I left, but it was like, I was the one who had to get myself out of there. And, but I still felt an immense pressure, which was all self-induced. And that's the thing about anxiety is it's not just victim shame, but just to be aware that anxiety is a self-induced state. But I became, my coping mechanism, if you will, to the trauma was my career. So that's really where I leaned in. I focused on academics, got almost a perfect GPA, got a full scholarship to Harvard. Before getting my first journalism job, I had worked at 5 different journalism internships. And the scholarship that I got was a journalism scholarship for Harvard. Went to work on Wall Street at Goldman Sachs and Moody's Investor Service, and also worked at a few different media companies and media startups, speaking in front of millions of people on these big shows. So on the one hand, I had this shiny resume, and on the other hand, I had this dark, very unstable anti-resume of the shame and the guilt and the things I was trying to hide and suppress. And it all just collapsed and kind of collided in 2019 because I had not learned healthy trauma responses in work environments, and also just behaviors and choices that I made with a startup that I was running. I have a chapter on how that all happened. I let the startup take over my life. I was not running the startup was running me. And ended up losing all my life savings, ended up almost dying from an allergic reaction to a drug they had given me to try to treat the fibromyalgia. So it was just a lot. And that's part of why I wrote the book, is because right now we do have the highest suicide rate since 1941, which is the Great Depression. And so I call what's happening right now the new Great Depression. And we also have the highest depression rate ever and the highest number of suicides ever. So the most recent statistics we have is 2022, almost 50,000 Americans killed themselves, which is almost 17 times the number of people who died on 9/11. And that's every year. So something's wrong. And the more I looked into how my healing came about through faith community, it really was, I began to see that I was not alone. So eventually after 2019, and I was a Christian at that point, I was baptized December of 2017, but I still was laboring under this pressure that I had to earn my self-esteem, or I had to earn the approval of others. I just couldn't just love myself and accept myself. I had to always be working and getting credentialing and things like that. And it's been that journey since then of getting plugged into healthy faith community that has helped me pray through very specific traumas, and have that spiritual recovery. And what I found in looking at the data is that overwhelmingly, if you are in faith community, if you're going to services weekly, if you're praying daily, if all of these religious practices, you are, according to Psychiatric Times, they did a literature review of almost 150 studies. 90% of these studies found a strong relationship between low substance abuse and high religiosity. There was a study from Harvard School of Public Health that found if you went to weekly church service, you were 68% less likely to die by suicide, opioid overdose, or drug overdose, or alcohol overdose. As a woman, you were 68% less likely. Men were 33% less likely to die, which is interesting. I have theories on why there's a gender gap, but in any case, both are like highly statistically significantly less likely to die. And same thing with the National Bureau of Economic Research. They found states that had higher religious participation had lower suicides. So it's just like scientifically, there's overwhelming evidence that faith is good for your brain. It's good for suicidal prevention. It's good for your emotions. And yet the psychologists are literally the most atheist profession. That's according to a Harvard study. So they've done studies on, one study found that psychologists are 61% of them describe themselves as atheist or agnostic. It was, which is totally not the general population. Gallup says that 80% of people do believe in God. So 80% of people believe in God, and 61% of psychologists do not. So there's a collision here. And actually Harvard, so that all these Harvard School of Public Health studies that I'm talking about are coming from this, this new research team that has devout Christians on the team. And I'm just worried they're going to be canceled, because they did try to cancel one of them for his Catholic faith. But so far, I think they're doing amazing work. And in fact, we're actually, if anyone listening or watching wants to come down here to DC on June 12th, we're hosting an event at the Museum of the Bible called The Bible and Mental Health. And we're bringing in experts. I have one coming from the Harvard Department of Neurology. And then I've got a pretty famous Christian therapist and professor from Baylor is coming in from Texas. And another professor from Catholic University, a sociologist who's done some big survey data on how churches view mental health. And he's going to talk about his data. And so really great lineup, and would love to have people, because again, the science is there. We just have to get the culture to trust the science.
Does God have a face? Does he have a body or even a name? If he does he know that I'm alive? Is God even here? Does she care that I doubt? Does she care that I fear? Something tells me God will survive. So take a breath, breathe it in, the mystery that is this, a universe we don't know. I think the truth is, if God has a face, his face must look like yours. Did God kill his kid? Did he have to have blood before he would forgive? Maybe we made a God that looks like us. Does God know my name? Is the ache in my soul just confined to my brain? Even so, does that mean it's not real? So take a breath, breathe it in, the mystery that is this, face must look like yours. A face like a Tina, an Ahmed or Mildred, a Russ and his husband, Gus and their children. A face like a Kim, a Ted or Tyrone, a Lucy born with an extra chromosome, a Pablo with legs he can't move by himself, a girl born a Daniel who now is Danielle, a Bill H and Yee, even white guy's name Todd. If you have a heartbeat, you are the face of God. So take a breath, breathe it in, the mystery that is this universe. We don't know, but I think the truth is, if God has a face must look. If God has a face, his face must look. If God